Jason Morgan's footsteps crunched softly against the gravel road leading into Willow Creek, a town that time had barely touched, yet one that carried the heavy weight of his past. The air was thick with memories, the kind that settled deep in your bones, a mixture of faded laughter and whispered regrets that clung to the sagging porches and peeling paint of the houses lining Main Street. For 22 years, Jason had buried this place beneath layers of ambition, of boardrooms and breakthroughs in Silicon Valley. But now, standing at its edge, the past was clawing its way back. His chest tightened as he glanced at the worn sign marking the entrance to the town, a faint echo of a childhood that had never fully belonged to him. Jason had left Willow Creek at 18, fueled by anger and disappointment, vowing never to return. His mother's death when he was 17 had shattered something inside him, and his father, Henry Morgan, had become a stranger in the years that followed. That silence between them was a chasm filled with unanswered questions, bitter fights, and a distance that grew insurmountable. He wasn't here out of nostalgia. Closure was the word that looped through his mind, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could untangle the knot of grief and resentment that had shadowed him all these years. But the town held its secrets close, and Jason knew that some answers wouldn't come easily. The familiar sights and sounds assaulted him. The distant bark of a dog, the creak of a rusty gate swinging in the breeze, the soft hum of the old diner's neon sign flickering in the dusk. He stepped inside Mabel's diner, where time seemed to have stopped, the vinyl booths cracked and worn, and the jukebox still stubbornly playing Johnny Cash on a loop. The smell of strong coffee and fried grease filled the air, grounding him in a world so different from the sterile boardrooms he'd mastered. Jason slid into a booth near the window, ordering a black coffee that he had no intention of drinking. His mind churned with fragments of his mother's laughter, soft and radiant, mingled with the coldness that had settled in his father's eyes after her death. Why had Henry shut him out so completely? Why had the man who once held him so tightly become a ghost? As he waited, Jason's gaze drifted across the room, landing on a young woman working tirelessly behind the counter. She moved with a quiet determination, wiping down tables, refilling coffee cups, her tired but practiced smile never quite reaching her eyes. There was something familiar about her, something he couldn't place yet. The weight of his solitude pressed down harder in this small town where everyone knew each other's names, but no one knew his story, or perhaps no one wanted to. He was a man built on data, patterns, and logic, yet here in Willow Creek, nothing fit the neat formulas he'd mastered. The past was messy, tangled with secrets buried deep beneath years of silence. And Jason knew the hardest part was yet to come, uncovering the truth that had been waiting for him all along. He sipped his coffee, not out of habit, but as a small anchor in a storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The road back home was long, winding, and fraught with shadows, but Jason Morgan was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Jason's hand closed around the cold metal of the pendant before he fully registered it. A small, intricately carved locket, half buried beneath a loose floorboard in his late mother's old room, the room he hadn't dared enter until now. The moment he lifted it, a jolt shot through him, as if the object carried the weight of every secret Willow Creek had tried to bury along with it. The locket was worn, its edges softened by time, but the craftsmanship was unmistakably delicate, like something meant to be hidden in plain sight. His fingers trembled as he flicked it open, revealing a faded photograph inside. 2 children, a boy and a girl, their smiles frozen in a moment long past. A wave of confusion surged through Jason's mind. He had never seen these children before. The photograph was unfamiliar, yet somehow achingly intimate, like a whispered message from the past trying to break through his carefully constructed walls. The room smelled of dust and old wood, the peeling wallpaper curling away like brittle memories. Jason sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the locket clutched tightly in his palm. Why had this been hidden here? Why now? His mother's room, untouched since her death, was a shrine to a life half-remembered, a life full of stories he'd never been told. His heart raced as the silence around him deepened, shadows lengthening like fingers creeping across the floor. The photograph was a puzzle piece that didn't fit with the narrative he'd lived by. His mother, his father, himself. But who were these children? And why was this locket kept so carefully out of sight? The questions began to unravel threads he'd spent years trying to knot tight. The memory of his father's coldness, his sudden withdrawals, came rushing back. Was it possible that the man he had condemned for abandoning them had been protecting some hidden truth? Or was it all another layer of betrayal? Jason's mind spiraled through possibilities. Maybe his mother had tried to shield him from a pain she couldn't bear to share. Maybe the truth was more complex than the black and white stories of abandonment and loss he'd told himself. The locket was a symbol, a tangible piece of the past demanding to be acknowledged, forcing him to confront the fractures in his family's history. He carefully placed the locket in his pocket and stood, his legs unsteady beneath the weight of revelation. There was no going back now. The quiet town of Willow Creek held its secrets close, but Jason was no longer willing to be kept in the dark. Every step he took from that moment onward would be toward the truth, no matter how jagged or painful it might be. Outside, the evening sky deepened into twilight, the first stars prickling the horizon. Jason paused at the window, the cold glass pressing against his palm, and allowed himself a moment to breathe. The road to understanding was just beginning, and beneath the quiet surface of Willow Creek, something long buried was stirring awake. Jason sat alone in the dim light of his childhood bedroom, the locket resting heavily on the nightstand as if it bore the weight of the entire past. His mind churned relentlessly, piecing together fragments of memories and half-forgotten conversations that suddenly took on new meaning. The photograph inside the locket, the two children, haunted him, their innocent faces like a riddle locked deep in his family's shadows. The room felt smaller now, suffocating almost, as if the walls themselves were closing in to demand answers. Jason's breath caught in his throat when a sudden realization struck him. What if those children weren't strangers? What if they were part of a story he had been kept deliberately apart from? His pulse quickened as he grappled with the possibility that the past was far more tangled than he'd ever imagined. His thoughts drifted back to the few people who had remained in Willow Creek all these years, those whose lives had intersected with his family's in ways he'd never understood. Among them was Grace, his mother's oldest friend, the woman who had taken care of the house after her death, the one who had always seemed too cautious when Jason tried to ask about his mother's last days. Grace's quiet eyes, often full of unspoken sorrow, suddenly flickered in his memory like a warning he'd ignored. Jason realized that Grace might hold the missing pieces, the truth buried beneath years of silence and protective lies. But confronting her meant stepping into a fragile emotional minefield. Grace was more than a friend. She was a guardian of secrets, some of which might shatter the fragile reality Jason had built around his family. He felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach, a mix of fear and desperation. What if the truth was more painful than the lies? What if his father's coldness, his mother's sudden withdrawal, and his own exile were all part of a hidden narrative he wasn't ready to face? Still, Jason knew he couldn't run from it any longer. The locket was a silent summons, a key to unlocking the door he had kept locked for decades. He needed to confront Grace, to peel back the layers of deception and finally see the full picture, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of betrayal, love, and sacrifice that lurked beneath. As twilight deepened outside the window, Jason stood and grabbed his coat, the locket burning a hole in his pocket as if urging him forward. The walk to Grace's house was short but felt like crossing a threshold into a past he'd long tried to escape. Each step was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and the fragile hope that perhaps understanding might lead to forgiveness. At her door, Jason hesitated, his heart pounding in a rhythm that echoed years of silence. When Grace opened it, her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of recognition, of fear, or perhaps guilt. Jason met her gaze steadily and spoke with a voice steadier than he felt inside. "I found this," he said, pulling the locket from his pocket, "and I need to know what it means. About those children. About everything I don't understand." For a moment, the room was swallowed by silence, the air thick with the weight of all the stories left untold. And then Grace's shoulders sagged, as if the years of holding back had finally broken her resolve. The secrets of Willow Creek were on the verge of unraveling, and Jason was about to step into the heart of a truth that would redefine everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and love. Jason stood on the cracked porch, the weight of the night pressing down like the dense fog rolling through Willow Creek's empty streets. The confrontation with Grace had opened a fissure beneath his carefully constructed reality, and now the pieces he'd tried so desperately to ignore clawed their way to the surface. The truths she revealed were not just painful, they were fractures splitting the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his family. He remembered the exact words, sharp and trembling with years of held-back grief. "Your mother didn't want you to know, Jason. She thought it would protect you from pain, from betrayal, from the ruin she saw coming." But the ruin had already come. Grace's confession unveiled not only the existence of those children, siblings he never knew, but also the role his father had played in a secret that twisted love and loyalty into something almost unrecognizable. Jason's chest tightened, breaths shallow as his mind struggled to comprehend the magnitude of it. His father had not abandoned them out of cruelty or weakness. No, he had vanished to shield them from a storm Jason had never anticipated. The unraveling of a family under the weight of secrets darker than Jason could have imagined. Memories surfaced like shards of broken glass, moments with his mother, fragmented and distorted now by Grace's revelations. The late-night whispers, the furtive glances exchanged with strangers, the sudden emptiness that filled the house after his father's disappearance. Every fragment took on a new, painful clarity. Yet, amidst the chaos of emotions, a quieter, more terrifying truth emerged. Jason's understanding of love was shattered. The father he had vilified, the mother he had mourned, the family he had longed for, they were all entangled in a web of sacrifice and silence. What was love, if not a battleground of unspoken wounds and impossible choices? The room felt colder, as if the shadows themselves recoiled from the truths Jason now carried. He gripped the locket tighter, its edges digging into his palm, a physical anchor to a past he could no longer deny but still didn't fully understand. His own reflection in the cracked mirror caught his eye, hollowed and raw, a man caught between who he had been and who he must become. Forgiveness seemed distant, almost unattainable. Yet beneath the bitterness and confusion flickered a fragile ember of something new: acceptance. Jason realized that facing the past meant more than uncovering secrets. It meant wrestling with the complex, often painful humanity of those he loved. It meant embracing imperfection and betrayal as part of the messy, beautiful tapestry of life. Outside, the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, promising a new day. Jason exhaled slowly, the breath steadying as the weight on his chest eased just enough to remind him that healing was a journey, not a destination. The past would always haunt Willow Creek, but Jason understood now that he didn't have to carry it alone. The truth was out, raw and unvarnished. And for the first time in years, Jason felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild something stronger from the ruins. Jason stood at the threshold of a new beginning, the weight of his past still heavy but no longer an anchor dragging him down. The scars left by betrayal and silence had not faded. They never would, but they no longer defined him. In the quiet moments with Emily and the children, he found fragments of peace he had once believed impossible. Building a family after years of solitude was like learning to breathe again after being underwater. Each smile from Emily, each tentative step from the children, was a small miracle that slowly stitched his fractured heart together. Yet beneath the surface, Jason wrestled with a tempest of doubts and fears. Could he truly be the father and partner they needed? Could he forgive himself for the years lost in bitterness and absence? The nights were the hardest. When the house was still and the world outside quiet, the ghosts of his past whispered relentlessly. Memories of pain and loss, of words never said and wounds never healed, rose like waves threatening to pull him under. Yet, in those darkest hours, he also felt a fierce determination to break the cycle, to rewrite the story not with silence but with love and honesty. Emily's patience and quiet strength became his anchor. She did not expect perfection. She only wanted presence. Her hands in his, her steady gaze, were reminders that love was not about flawless beginnings but about persistence through brokenness. Together they navigated the fragile dance of trust, sometimes faltering, sometimes soaring, learning how to weave their lives into a shared future. The children, with their innocent hopes and raw emotions, were both a challenge and a blessing. Jason watched as they grappled with their own shadows, the fears of abandonment, the yearning for acceptance. In their laughter and tears, he saw reflections of himself and promises of healing. He vowed silently to be the father they needed, to be the shelter he never had. Slowly, the walls of his heart expanded, room by room, to welcome the messy, beautiful chaos of family life. Arguments and misunderstandings were inevitable, but so were forgiveness and grace. Jason learned to listen, not just to words but to the silences beneath them, to the fears hidden behind smiles, and the hopes tucked away in quiet moments. Building a family was not a return to what was lost. It was the creation of something new, fragile yet fierce, shaped by pain but defined by hope. As seasons changed outside, inside the house where laughter now mingled with tears, Jason felt a quiet truth settle deep within him. The past was a story told, but the future was a story still being written. And with Emily by his side, and the children trusting him to lead, Jason knew that no matter how dark the night, dawn would always come. Jason sat quietly by the window, the soft morning light filtering through the thin curtains, casting fragile patterns across the worn wooden floor. The house felt different now. Not empty, not hollow, but full of a subtle warmth that had been missing for so long. It was the kind of warmth that didn't rush or demand, but lingered quietly in the corners, in the laughter of children playing, in the steady rhythm of everyday life slowly stitching broken edges back together. He thought about the long road that had led him here, the betrayals, the silence, the years spent carrying wounds too heavy to share. Those memories still surfaced, unbidden, sharp and raw, but they no longer held him captive. Instead, they had become part of the fabric of his being, threads woven through with pain, yes, but also resilience and understanding. The cracks in his heart, once fractures that threatened to shatter him, were now openings where light found its way in. Forgiveness was not a sudden epiphany for Jason. It was a slow, uneven process, like learning to walk on uneven ground after a fall. Forgiving his father, forgiving Grace, forgiving the mother he had idolized and mourned. These were not simple acts of release, but complex negotiations with his own grief and anger. He realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing the past, but choosing to no longer be defined or destroyed by it. More unexpectedly, forgiveness included himself. For the years of bitterness, for the walls he'd built around his heart, for the moments he'd let despair consume him. He understood now that self-forgiveness was the hardest kind, the one that required gentleness where he had been harshest, patience where he had demanded too much, and acceptance where he had once sought only fault. Hope, too, was a fragile thing, sometimes flickering, sometimes bright, but it was no longer a distant dream or a desperate plea. It was a quiet presence growing steadily inside him, rooted in the daily acts of love and courage. Every morning he woke, every small kindness he offered, every step toward rebuilding trust was a thread weaving a new tapestry, one not of perfection but of honest humanity. Emily's smile as she reached for his hand, the children's laughter echoing from the garden, even the simple sound of the wind through the trees. They were reminders that life, despite its scars, was still capable of beauty and renewal. Jason knew the past would always be there, shadows lingering in the corners of his mind, but it no longer ruled the narrative. He was learning to live not as a prisoner of what had been, but as an architect of what could be. The hope he held was not naive. It was forged in the crucible of pain and tempered by the hard-won grace of forgiveness. It was a commitment, to himself, to those he loved, and to the possibility of a future where healing was not just a word but a lived experience. As the sun climbed higher, filling the room with light, Jason allowed himself a quiet, unguarded smile. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt the steady pulse of hope beating beneath his ribs. Steady, enduring, alive.